the recording.
All right, well, thank you, Nancy. I have the pleasure of introducing our key speaker for this session. So Renee Pfeifer-Luckett is the Director of Teaching and Learning Technology from the University of Wisconsin. And they have this little thing called the DLE, just like we have the thing called the DLE. So it's great pleasure to have a colleague from across the country to present her perspective on their DLE. So go ahead, Renee, and
great. Thanks,
we're cheering for you.
Thank you so much. And hello, everyone out there. Good afternoon, good morning. Not sure where your time zone is, but we're glad you're here. And I'm very appreciative of you taking the time to join us here today. I do want to preface the talk a little bit by saying, please use the chat. With these types of sessions, there's an exchange of ideas that you can't always replicate by raising your hand and asking the question, that sometimes it's really organic in the chat. So I just want to encourage all of you to communicate with each other. Harry's on hand to take some questions. I'm open to taking questions along the way. This is sort of a storytelling session, so it's not exactly the most interactive sort of talk, but I do want to engage with you and hear your thoughts. And since you're on a very similar journey at SUNY that we took at the University of Wisconsin system, I think you'll find some things to be interesting, I hope. And maybe you're at the point, I'm suspecting, where some of you may be sort of, where are we going with this thing? And hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll have some ideas of some of the benefits and the good things that come out of a common system. So I'm going to, you're going to learn a little bit about how we contracted for our LMS. And even though it was set to expire, the work that we put in, extensive work we put in to doing some research and some stakeholder analysis, we really were setting out to really reimagine what learning technology could be for our institutions. And so with always that goal of ensuring student success. So I'll also discuss a little bit about the process of that engagement to identify the key needs in learning technologies that we knew we needed to address. And most importantly, we want to put forward and share with you all of those benefits we've realized, as well as the ultimate impact on that the new technology environment had on teaching and learning at our system institutions. So very briefly, I just wanted to set the stage in terms of Wisconsin, right? We are a system like SUNY. We are certainly not as large as the largest comprehensive university system that SUNY is. But I'd like to put some context on our scope. We have a suite of learning technology solutions that supports 26 campuses, 13 of which are 4 years, and 13 which are formerly colleges and 2 years, but have been merged through a process to become satellites of some of our campuses. So you can see that in the diagram out here. We have about 165,000 students and nearly 41,000 faculty and staff within our system. The DLE supports 4 credit courses, employee training and professional development, continuing education programs, and more. Just to help with the geographical placing of Wisconsin, Canada is up on the north, and Chicago is about an hour and a half south of us. And the Wisconsin-Madison, I should also mention right off the bat, is not—
Renee, your slides are not advancing. All we see is your first main slide. So I'm not sure if it's how you shared your slides, maybe.
Could be. Thank you for pointing that out. Did it advance at that point?
There you are.
Yep.
We see
Okay.
the mitten and little stars on the mitten.
Excellent. Well, thank you for pointing that out. I have a feeling I have to click elsewhere to make the slides advance. So in any case, here we are, as I mentioned, and but back to University of Wisconsin-Madison, they took a different procurement path with regard to their LMS implementation, but we still share licenses to some of the other tools included in the DLE. So I wanted to recognize that distinction. So when we talk about disruption, and that's really what we're doing, right? We're disrupting a lot of things that normally were happening on a day-to-day basis when we change out technologies. And before we delve into too many details, I'd like to explore a little bit about the internal and the external factors that led us to where we are today. From what I understand, SUNY has also experienced some of these disruptors, and you have also gone down the path of a digital learning environment. So at first we had the same and had built out the same technology systems for years. Actually, since 2002, we had the same LMS and the same basic suite of tools. We also had a system that was set up so each campus had their own instance, if you will, or copy of the learning management software at their own campus and managed it locally. And I think if I recall correctly, we have some of that within the SUNY system too. You're in that same situation. So needless to say, when you have lots of copies of software and being manipulated and tweaked and used in very different ways, it doesn't create a lot of consistency or a lot of ability to share ideas because everyone's doing something a little bit different. So we knew we needed a technology refresh, and we went in going in thinking, can we do this as a system versus as institutions and campuses alone? And our contract with our LMS provider was about to expire. So we knew the end was coming of the contract, and we took that as an opportunity to do this technology refresh. At the same time, our president had released a new, and this is about 2014, a new UW system, what was called the 2020 Forward Strategy. And so we had some internally external factors that were also sort of acting as a disruptor. And so the key tenet that came out of that strategy that we thought related to the digital learning environment was to grow a more creative and engaging educational experience so all learners can compete and succeed in a global environment. We took that piece of it and built upon that notion of providing an ecosystem that helps our students learn and grow. We also had, around that same time, we were seeing contemporary technologies that were coming out, and they were providing a user experience that previous generations of learning technologies really couldn't. They were open, they're connected, they're personalized, and they can even be set up in a way that is fixed, sort of the things that are the same, as well as flexible. So we could accommodate some customization at the local level to meet the needs of teaching and learning. So significant progress was made also by standards bodies, and we aligned with IMS Global, if you're familiar with that organization, and learning technology standards organization that's community driven. And we really liked the way they were developing standards for interoperability, meaning the way that tools would connect within this digital environment. And so we saw some really good progress on the standards front. And finally, the implementation of the actual project, I guess we can call it, was driven by the academic side of the house, not the administrative side or the technology side. So we did not consider this a technology initiative. We considered this an academic project. And that really set the stage for a different sort of lens on how people viewed this. This wasn't a CIO, pushing out a new technology. This was really driven by academics and pedagogy. So we had a very charismatic and wonderfully supportive VP of Academic and Student Affairs at the time, who really mandated that the students should have a seamless educational experience with the learning technology that we provide as a UW system. And then also the buy-in process included the provosts and the CIOs at our campuses were also brought along and supported the effort. So it was a team that did the project, but it took an entire village, I'd say even a large city in our case, to move the needle on this project. So I want to acknowledge all of the support that we also received along the way. So I mentioned earlier about engagement with stakeholders. And I think this is, if there was one, there could have been one point of failure in this project, it would have been a failure to properly engage with our stakeholders. And I think all of you in higher education especially understands the need to hear the voices and the many different voices that are out there in terms of needs, especially around learning technology from the perspective of a student versus an instructional designer versus a learning technologist versus any of the myriad of other institutional researchers might even like to get some of the data out of the digital learning environment. So there's a lot of folks out there, registrars as well, who we did some very significant stakeholder engagement. And even though this is a very short slide, I can tell you that each of those years was a very long year, but very necessary in the process of getting those needs identified and the gaps identified. So we underwent this multi-year effort to understand the needs for teaching and learning by engaging with stakeholders at every institution. The first step was the roadmap, the learning technology roadmap, which was completed by my predecessor, and it was actually on a campus prior to coming to the system office. And so I was happily a participant as a campus person in that process. And so I had deep knowledge of what they were trying to achieve. And they brought together a group from all across the system to just really sit down for a day and have a facilitated discussion about what were the big ahas, what were the big gaps, what were the things that folks were struggling with the most. And again, we included all sorts of folks in that conversation, including all the ones I just mentioned, and more. And, when you really start looking, even the financial aid office had some representatives there to sort of think about how students engage with this learning technology. So as a result of the road mapping activity, it really revealed that even deeper stakeholder engagement was going to be necessary. And we sort of suspected that going in, but this was our first sort of pass to see how we can make that work. And that clearly the student voice needed to be in the mix. And we needed to hear what students had to say. Now, before I go to the 2015 part of this conversation, I want to also point out the economy we were struggling in higher ed with all of the defunding that was going on and budget cuts. So the temperature of the campuses was not good. The psyche of our students and our faculty wasn't that great either. All the support staff were already overburdened, and the budget cuts really were really tough on us in Wisconsin. And I know this has happened numerous other places, but at that point in time, things were not looking very good and people were not happy. And so with that context, my colleague and I, LaVon Cornell Swanson, who's now moved to another university, but she representing the academic and student affairs side, and I representing the administrative side of the system office, went on a tour, not once, but twice, and visited every four-year campus and a handful of the colleges. And we held listening sessions. And we asked some questions that really were probing, and we worked with some researchers to really get at some questions that would help us understand where those gaps were and what the needs were. And responses from students were really amazingly insightful, and their need for accessible content came through so loud and clear that we knew that had to be a really important piece of what we were going to do. So we went about this needs analysis. We called it the LENA project, the Learning Environment Needs Analysis Project. And that really came out with a really good report. And I will talk a little bit more about the outcomes of that. But together we represented all the system offices, and we traveled and did all of these visits. And then we had great insights that came out, not only into the current environment, but where the future might lie for learning technology, and what people were thinking about on the campuses, and the way that things were. 2015, things were really starting to change, and we had Second Life come on the scene in the early 2000s. There's some new technologies around that time that people were dabbling with and taking a look at to see how they might leverage those technologies to improve student learning outcomes. So we did uncover lots of wants and needs at our institutions and identified the gaps in our learning technologies. So when I talk about the vision really grew out of all of the work that had been done at that point, which would have been the road mapping experiment, sort of, and then of course the Lena work. So we really developed this vision about what could be this digital learning environment going forward, with all of these sort of results put into the mix. When we sat down and looked at the results especially from the Lena sessions, we noticed that there was a really interesting alignment along with the work of Brown, Delaney, and Millichap in their 2015 EDUCAUSE white paper on that next generation digital learning environment, NGDLE. And I'm sure some of you have heard of that as well, and may have been part of what SUNY was looking at that time too. So we really sifted through the results, and 5 key characteristics of this future state of a digital learning environment emerged. And you'll see them on the slide here. The first one was really about the principles of universal design and accessibility. And what came through clearly was that accessibility is for all. And there were so many different student examples of how they use transcripts, how they use captioning, for example, and how we knew we needed to make those things available more readily and more accessible to our students and faculty as well. But in order to succeed, and in order for students to be able to move through and matriculate, we have to lower those barriers, and accessibility was a no-brainer and front and center of everything we did. The second point, when we look at the data, and I'll get into this a little bit later as well, but you were hearing more conversations around analytics, and folks were really interested in getting the data out of these systems, out of these learning technologies. And traditionally, those were pretty locked down by vendors. They didn't let that data out. And so we knew we wanted to sort of blow that open and say, we want an environment where we can get at the data and use it to answer questions that we had. And so, beyond the administrative analytics, we were looking at student readiness, learning assessment, progress mapping, advising. That notion of early alerts was happening around that time as well, if you recall, that we may use to trigger interventions, or at least to be able to know what's happening with our students in a little bit more detail. The third one, collaboration, was something that is expected and encouraged and supported among and within, and outside the institutions. And because we're a system like SUNY, you know very well that collaboration needs to be also one of those key tenets. We look at interoperability, getting a little bit on the techie side, is looking at how tools can integrate with one another. As you well know, there are now standards like LTI and some others that can be used to help integrate those tools. But back then, it was still an emerging thing, having tools that really could speak to each other. And vendors, honestly, they weren't particularly motivated to want to be able to do that as well, because they had proprietary software and proprietary things that they didn't want to share. And then the last point is we knew personalization was something that we needed to pay attention to. We take that for granted now, but even just a few years ago, there wasn't quite the interest in personalization as there is today and now. And so I'm glad that we sort of set the stage to be able to personalize when we're ready and at a level that's appropriate, whether it be a college level, department level, an institution, or system wide. So personalized experience for the students with regard to both the content and pathways. So we looked at it from both lenses. So these characteristics were really infused into the functional and technical requirements of the subsequent RFP that we needed to run, which you can see on the slide, which was the following year in 2017. We did a kind of interesting RFP. We used use case scenarios. We asked the vendors to respond by showing how their products and services or tools would actually meet the needs of a scenario. So an example of a scenario would be Dr. Smith teaches a face-to-face course of 120 students and wants to use the learning technology suite in order to have online discussions and break them into groups and, all those sorts of things. And we really developed all of those use cases based on what we learned in the LENA project. So that LENA project was informative in many ways, and it also really helped us to write a really nice RFP. I'm still very proud of it, and I can share more information on that whole process. We've got everything online, so everything I'm talking about today, there's lots more information that I can share with you. So once we had the RFP on the street for a digital learning environment, so that was kind of a novel thing. People kept wanting to call it an LMS. We're like, no, we don't want to be boxed into thinking about this as an LMS. We want to think about this as an environment. With our vision that DLE was going to bring together a suite of services and tools that support teaching and learning versus an administrative tool for managing course content. And then when the implementation phase came along, as you see from 18 to 20, and it's not lost on any of us what happened in 2020. And all I can say is by the skin of our teeth did we make it before COVID hit, which was a whole other issue that we'll talk a little bit about too. So how do the implementation, I could give an hours long talk just on that because of the heavy lift it was. And I'm sure SUNY is, if you're not already into that piece of it, it's a lot of work changing platforms. I don't think that's a shock to anyone here. But we knew two things. We were going to need exceptional communication and exceptional cooperation amongst the institutions and system-wide. And we also take cooperation between a lot of siloed units on our campuses that that was probably one of the toughest parts, is getting the student information system people and the registrar people and some of the other technical ends of the project together and being able to talk the same language, which was difficult. And then bring in instructors and instructional designers with the pedagogy so that they can understand, we're implementing it in this way to actually benefit them. So I just can't stress enough how much and how important it was to have that collaborative spirit going into it. And that's where senior leadership really came in and helped to reinforce that. So we established a network. We sat down and tried to figure out how can we do this, because this is not a system driven thing. There's no way a system office could make this all roll out without assistance. So we went to a model that's used pretty often in IT projects. And then we used what we call the DLE institutional liaison. So we deputized on each campus a point of contact, the liaison, who are, and to this day are, critical in keeping our campuses informed on changes and updates to the tools, as well as providing a clear communication channel between campus stakeholders and the DLE service management team. So again, that's a really large swath at a very complicated process, but did want you to recognize the importance that those institutional liaisons, and I'm guessing you will also have something similar. So just making sure the slide advanced there. I'd like to take a short dip into some of the technical issues, but before we do, I wanted to just sort of open the floor for a moment to see if there were any immediate questions that came to mind. And Harry, I don't know if there's anything that's come up in the chat.
There isn't anything for you to address that came up in chat.
Okay.
I do have a question for you though.
Sure.
So you talked about the RFP process and how you outlined all of these use cases. How significant was the scoring for determining who was selected based on those use cases?
Right. I don't have the percentage breakdown, but the use cases represented the functional analysis, not the technical analysis and not the cost benefit analysis, but it was the functional. And I think it was 30 to 40%, if I recall. Okay. Yeah. So it was significant, because really that was the whole point, right, of trying to go through all this, is to really get at meeting those needs. And the technology is important, but it doesn't stand still either. So it was more important to us that the tools could do what we needed them to do.
And just out of curiosity, and if you can't answer this, that is okay. How many use cases did you actually have?
We had 8, as I recall.
Okay.
And the full RFP is online. So if you're interested in seeing that, I can make sure I add that link to the slide presentation when it's shared out.
I think it would be interesting.
It was the first time the UW system ever ran an RFP with use cases. So it was a new method in the procurement world. And we said, well, let's give it a try. And it worked out really beautifully. So yeah.
Great, thank you.
So you're most welcome. So really I really didn't know how technical we wanted to go with this session. So I put in a couple of quick slides here just to make sure that we are familiar with some of the more of the technical aspects of this. But one of our largest challenges that we considered to be the cause of many of the gaps in our current learning technology systems was the seamless integration of the learning management system with third-party tools. And then also the lack of governance around installing and using learning technology tools. And I wouldn't be surprised if you all folks had some similar issues with that. And to speak plainly, it was a wild west of tool integrations. Each campus had their own sort of methodology, if you will, for bringing tools into the environment. There was no central authority in terms of, looking at things like accessibility and data privacy and all of those issues. So that was a big problem. And we knew going in that, we kind of wanted to try and see if we could do this one instance model and could it work? And so we invited as many folks as we could to come and poke holes at it. And we were able to really overcome a lot of the objections to this one instance model. Was it easy? No, but you'll see later, there's a lot of folks who are glad we did that. And so, given those challenges about the tool integrations and sort of the governance around it, we knew that that was going to be a specific focus. And so I wanted to mention that here so that you knew this didn't all just kind of magically happen. It took some deliberate planning and some serious stakeholder buy-in to get to the point where we could actually move forward. Because remember, not at that time, vendors were not always very focused on interoperability of the tools. They would develop the next, cool, shiny thing and market it to faculty, and faculty would get excited. And then when it comes time to actually installing the software, there's a bunch of issues. That happened a lot. So for those campuses who were really screening that sort of thing. So, interoperability of tools was something we really wanted to go for. Consistent access to the tool generated data was also a piece of this. With our prior LMS, we were locked out of our data unless we wanted to pay a lot of money to find a way to extract the data. And even then, we didn't know what we were going to do with it. So not only having access to the data, but having access to data that we could use. So that was something else that we knew going into this that would be important. And so, the issues that are up here, the accessibility, the tools didn't always have accessibility in mind when they were initially designed. And many of you would understand that software sometimes cannot be, the code can't be changed in certain instances to make something more accessible. So we knew that we wanted the tools to really be accessible, born accessible if possible. But vendors didn't always see it that way, and they didn't always take actions, and some still don't, to rectify those issues. And in our current environment, vendors who don't step up and do what's right on some of those things are not invited to integrate with our digital learning environment. We also had a lot of vendors who weren't aligned with industry standards. And that may seem like not the most important thing, but it's really interesting when you really do operate within a standards body and you're working in a common way to bring these technologies together. We also had issues with vendors accessing our students' data. That was probably one of the scarier pieces when when we were vetting some of these applications, and where was that student data going and how was it being leveraged, and was it even really being sold, which we found in some cases. So the student data privacy piece was very significant. And then the last one about security, which again, right now, especially, we're very vigilant with the way things are in the world right now about security issues. In 2015, for us, we were really looking at the fact that with this hodgepodge of tool integrations, it really created a significant risk in security, and being able to get into our systems and get into the digital learning environment, which then gains entry to other systems. So that was another very very important part of how we designed the system. And we had a new security officer start at system around the same time, and so luckily we had an advocate in that area, which really helped spur along our progress. So this is the last of the technical bit, but I did want to share this for those of you who are looking at, the administrative folks out there about, well, how do you actually put this into process? How do you centrally vet all of these tools? It was quite a process to come up with this, but I hope this is helpful for you all. We do have this process that we put in place. And as you can see, it goes all the way from the request. We have an initial intake process that we look at all the accessibility statements and look at the contract language or the licensing agreement to make sure that everything is, in line with what our legal team has deemed necessary. And then we go through that sort of initial intake, because that's where, if something's going to fall off, that's where it's going to fall off. If it's accessibility, security, student data privacy, any of those things, if it fails those tests and they're not willing to bring their product up to our standards, we didn't integrate. Now, that doesn't mean that it couldn't be used. It just couldn't be integrated within the DLE. And how many people are involved in the approval process? Well, we have a DLE team. So we have a functional architect that does the initial intake and kind of gives it the scratch test to make sure everything's okay, because we don't want to waste time with functional testing, the review process and all of that if it's not even going to make it past the first gate. So so we have a particular individual, the architect, who does that part. We then leverage our campuses to do the functional testing, because we just don't have the bandwidth. We're a team of 4-ish, truly, managing this entire environment. So we really leverage our institutions and our campuses. And there's a lot of great expertise out there that you can leverage to help you with some of these processes. So we have work groups set up. We have one that's actually set up around roles and permissions. So when the LMS, we use Canvas. When the LMS has a continuous release cycle, so there's always updates coming, we have a team made up of folks from 4 or 5 of our different campuses that actually review those updates to see if it's something, we always want to say yes to changes and only say no when it interferes with something that conflicts with our core fixed environment. But yeah, so we have the functional testing phase, which we leverage different work groups for different pieces of that across system. And then we have the final review, which is the team will go through and double check to make sure everything is done. We have a fairly extensive rubric, which I can share as well, that walks you through. And that rubric does the top 3 things first. So if the tool doesn't pass the top 3 things, it doesn't go any farther. But the rubric is quite extensive and looking at a lot of the different pieces of the agreement, the way it works, the way it integrates. Yes, absolutely. I will share that rubric with you. So the final review, and then that's where the go, no go happens. And I am both the service owner and the service manager. So I have to convince myself of things once in a while. Not really, but that's my standard joke. But if everything looks good, there's no reason why this integration shouldn't move forward. However, if something comes up in the final review maybe it's a security risk, we may have to run it by the security team, or maybe there's some other aspect of it that we're not quite sure about. And so we will go to some subject matter experts and stakeholders on our campuses, or even at the system office, to see if this is something that we can mitigate. If it can't be mitigated, then the institution requesting the integration is liable and responsible for taking responsibility for the risk that's introduced. But luckily, we haven't really had too many issues that gotten to that point where we didn't approve a tool. Usually the disapproval, if you will, happen right in the intake review. But sometimes, the vendors will do a great job and work with us and fix whatever it is that is a concern, and move forward. So we have a lot of good folks all over system, and I think that's the other takeaway I hope you have from this presentation, is that it's not a small team doing all this by themselves. It takes everyone to go ahead and participate and provide their expertise, because there's a lot of great talent out in your institutions. Okay. Sorry, my advancing slide thing is not cooperating. So when we talk about benefits, this is probably the piece you've been waiting for. Okay, so why are we going through this? And is it really going to be okay? And are we going to come out, much better than we were? And the answer is absolutely. While the DLE project was no small feat, it did demonstrate the amazing ability to collaborate and cooperate system-wide. And while it was a struggle at times to envision the ways in which our learning technology ecosystem would actually be improving our student learning outcomes, and the benefits can't be denied, and include this laundry list that you see on the slide. The first thing, though, is, as I alluded to earlier, it future-proofed us. Just in the nick of time, we had the last campuses going from our old LMS to our new LMS literally right before COVID hit. So, we set up the DLE in a way, and this might be something you want to think about if it's not, you're not too far down the road already, but we set it up so that every 4-credit course had a course shell created and was sitting in the background in an inactive state with the enrollment data regularly updated. And that was one of the things that we had written into the RFP and wrote into our contract, that we insisted that the RFP winner would be willing to work with us to get a student information system integration to a place where we can actually have up to real-time enrollments. And so that took several stages to get to that point, but we have several campuses now that are in real-time enrollments. Otherwise, it's a nightly batch. But yeah, so we had all these things, and when we moved to go pivot online because of COVID, it was really not easy, but it could have been a lot worse. The shells were there, and even if the instructor just put in their syllabus and a grade book to get by, which we thought was going to be a week or two, but then they already had something they could just build out and not have to worry about the enrollments and the ads drops and all that sort of thing. So that was really a good move on our part, and I'm glad that we did it, not knowing that would be the case, right? And see, Maureen, do you incorporate templates and or course review into the move from your former LMS to your DLE? Let me see. Yes-ish. What we did was the template actually came in the form of Canvas. So Canvas Learning Management System. We set up Canvas, and I mentioned the fixed flexible. So the fixed was sort of the template part of our Canvas environment, and the flexible were things that the local campuses could change. So one of the things, and this is a whole other conversation, but I'll give you a couple of teasers here. One of the things is the order of the buttons on the nav bar in an out of the box Canvas course can be moved. And we heard the students say, every time I log into a course, it looks different. The nav is different. I don't know where to find things. The syllabus is never in the same place. Or the instructor set it up and it's just one big long scrolling page and I can't find anything. So to that end, we set up the template for the course shell. so that the buttons remained in, the 5 main buttons remained in the same order, with the ability to add additional buttons at the bottom. But that was a significant hurdle. I mean, you can imagine that's kind of, how can you do that? But boy, especially after COVID hit and students were getting into more courses than they ever did before, because not all of their instructors and their professors had used a learning management system. So, you know, with Canvas at the core of the DLE, that's where that template piece came in. I hope that that helped. We did have some campuses who developed their own course templates as well. I can't really speak too much to the detail on that, but I know they found that students really appreciated having at least certain things standardized. It really did help. The 5 main navs, dashboard, and I might not have it in the right order, but I think it was, we also set it up in modules. We only enabled modules for the layout, which is a Canvas thing. So I'm not sure it really pertains to this, but yeah, they were kind of like those key nav buttons, home, dashboard, gradebook, assignments, I think. But again, depending on what your technology is, those things might be called differently. But I'm happy to share more on that. And again, we've got a website that has a lot of this information, so that'd be good to share. Okay, so quickly, benefits, because I want to leave some time for questions at the end as well. The consistent student experience, which I just alluded to talking about the templates. If a student is enrolled in a course at multiple UW system campuses, all of those courses in which they're enrolled will, at multiple campuses, will appear on one dashboard. So that was really important for us because we have a lot of collaborative programs across the UW system. We have a foreign language learning program where we'll have an instructor or professor at one campus delivering content to students who are at very, different campuses. So we knew we wanted to be able to have the students have a one-stop shop when trying to access their courses. We also have minimal customizations because, of course, that's whenever you customize, not only are you creating additional costs and maintaining those customizations, but we can reduce the risk of a continuous update cycle that the software goes through by not allowing customizations, at least as much as we can. And if customizations are absolutely necessary, we had a couple of instances, then the organization or the institution needs to take responsibility. If it breaks, there's no support, not from the vendor and not from system office. So that's kind of a deterrent in itself, because it costs the organization money to maintain that. So as I mentioned too about the flexibility, it's built in to accommodate the institution's needs. For example, institutions are able to brand at the campus level. So when you log into a UW Green Bay course, it says UW Green Bay and it's green. Not all of it's green, but the color is green. So it makes sense for them to do some institutional branding, and it helps students, if they are in multiple institutions, discern where they are and what courses they are in. And then, another one of the things that's kind of interesting is for institutional needs, and I'll just put this out there. I'm not sure if you participate in the NESE survey or the student survey, but we were able to set it up so that the link to the survey came right into their digital learning environment. And each student had their own link, and we were able to make that happen. So the actual response rate was incredible because that's where students live. They live in their LMS, their digital learning environment. And so when it's a notification and it comes up right, oh yeah, sure, I'll take that survey. So, there's a sweet spot to that as well. You don't want to overuse that announcements and sort of bombard the students with things, but it's an option, and it worked out really well for the NESE survey for us. The accessibility piece, supporting all instructional modes, face-to-face, online, blended, high flex, hybrid, fully online. That's the beautiful thing about the digital learning environment. It supports everything. Another thing to think about, and I'm not sure how this works at SUNY, but with our students, we have a Partners in Education program where high school students are able to take college courses, and they're considered non-matriculated because they're not really an official student at the university. So by the way that we set up our environment, it allows non-matriculated students to actually access and accommodate those kinds of programs with high school students and others. The tight standards and highly secured student information system and instructional tool integrations is also a benefit of the way that we've implemented the DLE. It really just reduces so many risks. And as we know, as we move through time, that risk factor just becomes greater and greater from more and more avenues, not just the traditional hacker types. Then, seamless access by all our institutions is really wonderful. We're able to set it up so that institutions only see their own institutional data. So if you're an administrator, for a DLE administrator for a campus, you'd only be able to see your things or things that are shared with you. But from a system office perspective, we have a look, we can see across all institutions. So we're getting to the point where we'd like to see some reporting where we can show tool usage, for example, and some other things, but that's going to be pretty exciting. We get a little further down the road on our reporting. And then, curricular models are emerging now with all sorts of interesting tools and technology. So we now have a platform that can accommodate that. From an efficiency standpoint, it's a once and done with the technical administration of the fixed environment. So we don't have to do it 13 or 26 times, which is helpful and saves a lot of resources in not having to do that. And then obviously the change management process is now a formal process, as you saw with that tool integration process, and it's transparently managed. So we have a shared document that anyone at system can go into to see what's been requested, when was it requested, and what's the use case for it, and that sort of thing. So we track all that and make it very transparent so folks can see what's happening internally, at least. And then lastly, the institutional access to data, I've kind of poked at that a couple of times, and we are developing reports. We now have one of our folks at one of the institutions was really interested in learning how to do reporting and running reports. And so we had someone sit down with that person and teach them how to do it. And now we get requests from other campuses, and that person can put together a report. So it's really nice. It's a distributed sharing model, right, of managing this whole thing, because a small central team could never handle all of that. And there's an EDUCAUSE article out there too, if you're interested in learning more. But quickly, impacts, I think, like a drop of water and makes ripples, this kind of my analogy on this slide. But we're really excited to see, COVID hit right when everything went go live, and at least system wide. And so it's been hard to really pull out hard data yet, but we're getting there. But definitely, students, we did a follow-up survey, which is another conversation, just last summer, trying to identify gaps that maybe students perceive still within the digital learning environment. So we had about 5,000 responses, student responses, all about their user experience. And we really focused on just that, like, can you navigate? Can you find what you need? And we did see just a high rate of satisfaction from the students, and yet some gaps. A search feature was one that came out. And name pronunciation tool. Students would really like to see that integrated into the DLE as well. So, I talked about the reporting. We're future resilient. We can really pivot and be nimble in a way that we couldn't before. We're looking at always trying to reduce barriers to access. And one thing that we recently did was a change request that came in from a campus is to enable by default auto captioning on our Kaltura videos. So we use Kaltura as our media management company. And so we were able to move that through, and now all videos that we have integrated in the DLE from that point forward actually are auto captioned. And then of course, the nirvana, the Valhalla, the end goal, if you will, of this whole piece is how do we now make sure that we can get to the data and use that data to help us, teach in different ways, help students be successful and to be able to move them through to matriculation much more efficiently. So it's a continuous improvement model. And I'm really excited for SUNY and going down this journey. And I'm not exactly sure where you are yet, but hopefully seeing the light at the end of the tunnel that I've shared here, these last couple of slides, will help you and even give you some talking points when dealing with some of the concerns that may come up during your process. So at that, I've got 8 minutes left, and I just wanted to make sure that if we had more questions or if I missed questions along the way, that we could have some of those and feel free to grab the mic. I'm hoping I think that's something you can do. So.
Yeah, you can either raise your hand and ask a question yourself, or you can type it in the chat. We'd love to hear who has the first question. Harry, you want to take that?
I can see it. I'm good. About expanding on the capabilities regarding the innovative practices in teaching and learning. Well, I think this is a low-hanging fruit piece, but just allowing collaboration to be much more seamless. I think especially, I called out the the collaborative foreign languages program has been, immensely easier for them to be able to share and collaborate online. That's been really helpful. But I think a lot of it too comes in through the tools. And because I'm not on a campus, I'm not sure I can speak specifically to, what they're doing. We do have something similar to SUNY. We have a virtual showcase that's happening in June, and I'll make sure that gets known so that anyone who wants to see some examples of the things that are going on with our faculty and how they're leveraging the digital learning environment, there'll be some really good examples of that as well. But Dan, there's a link to last year's showcase that I'll also share so that I'll put a bunch of resources in this slides before I send it over, and then you can take a look at that. There's some videos too, so you might enjoy seeing how faculty are using it. Absolutely, Dan.
Matt, you can unmute to ask a question.
Sure, thanks. A question that I had, it seemed to get some interest in the chat as well as myself, and that is the idea of the standard template for the online course, or just for all of your courses. And I'm curious what the decision-making process was for that. Did you have to go through any kind of governance structure, or was that just a decision that you were able to make based on the feedback that you had from students, or not? I guess that's my question.
Sure. So here's how I'd answer that. All of the stakeholder analysis, right? I mean, that sort of was put together so that we understood what those key things were that we knew. And we knew that the students wanted a standard approach, to integrate or to interacting with the digital learning environment. So we went with what we called the consent model. And that means that we would put something forward. And if someone wanted to, poke holes at it and say, no, you can't do it this way, we'd say, why? And then we'd go through a process of vetting, concerns, looking at risk. That's another big area that we're always focused on. So that's sort of the way we move things forward. We used the information we had. We did maybe some limited vetting just with specific stakeholders to just make sure that we were on the right track. And then we would put together a straw man, and then we would let the community, everyone who within system, to comment on it. And if there were concerns, like I said, we would mitigate them or we would make changes. And that's kind of how we've been rolling since then. But that's how the template sort of came to be. We had a work group put together a model, and then we vetted that model. There's another one. Are you finding that what students want, need has changed since your analysis and the onset of COVID? Well, we did our analysis after COVID. So what was last summer? So summer of 21. And I think if anything, I don't think the needs necessarily have changed, but they're better articulated. And I think that that's a result of the private sector with companies who are making apps and all these sorts of things that are super easy to use. Why can't, the learning technology be the same way? So I think the consumer side is pushing some of that demand for simplicity and integration and all that sort of thing. If anything, I think that's probably, Diane, the thing that I've noticed the most.
I have a question. So going back to the third-party tool review, and apologies if you had mentioned this, is this something that anyone can make this request, or you're looking at your campus liaisons to make these requests?
The campus liaison funnels, so they are aware of the requests that are coming in, but a request can originate from anyone. A student, faculty, registrar, institutional researcher. I don't know what they just want the data, right? So yeah, so those come in through the DLE institutional liaison to make sure that, one, it's not already a tool, because sometimes faculty don't know that there's tools out there, and kind of go through that initial looking at it to make sure it's okay to put forward. But yeah, it's been a real seamless process. We processed 30 change requests last year. Oh no, 32 integrations, 30 additional. So we're over 100 now. And we had 20 change requests that we processed. Not all of them got approved, but that went through the process. And so folks are pretty comfortable with that way now.
And I do have a follow-up. Sorry, Robin. So are there evaluations of tools that have similar functionality so that you don't have a lot of redundant tools, or is that something that you just embrace, that if a request goes through, it doesn't exist in the system, it has a desired functional need, and it passes all of the security steps, that's okay to have that additional tool in the system?
That becomes a funding question. So, we didn't kind of go there with this talk, but this digital learning environment is centrally funded and by campuses. It's a partnership model. And so things that aren't actually being implemented system-wide, say it's only 1 or 2 campuses want this particular tool, they have to fund it. We're comfortable with moving it forward. But oftentimes, if a campus knows that there's a similar tool, like let's say proctoring, for example, there's several different proctoring tools. If there's a tool that's already integrated and perhaps enterprise-wide supported and paid for, they're most likely going to use that. For that particular question, it oftentimes comes down to funding.
Okay, thank you.
And Robin?
Robin, hi. Thank you for a great session. And I'm also interested in a little bit more information about that third-party tool review process. It looks really very helpful for the campus. And so at on the page, you had a process that goes, a little arrow that shows the process going from request to approval. What kind of timeline do you usually get for that? And then I was also wondering, you said you would share the rubric with us. I would also be interested to see the request form and what kind of questions, and happy to talk offline about this too and share some other evaluations that we've been doing on some of the tools.
Yeah, absolutely. Reach out. I'm happy to. I guess I forgot to put my email on the slide. Let me see if I can add it to the chat. But to your first point, the timing really depends. I know that's a cop-out kind of answer, but the complexity of the tool, oftentimes can make it a little bit more of a lengthy process. We've also done them very quickly within a day or two. So again, it really depends on how deeply integrated the tool is. If you're familiar with what's it called? Ally is a accessibility checking tool. It goes really deep into the integration. So that would take, something like that would take longer to vet because there's more to look at.
Okay, a day or two on a couple of that sounds amazing how you did that.
Well, you know, it's when you have a process in place, it can go very quickly.
Great. And hopefully you saw Chris's question in the chat too. What's the most common reason why some of the tools didn't get approved?
Most common reason was either student data privacy, that the vendor would not agree to not harvest student data, or the vendor would not agree to make their tool accessible. I would say those are the two main reasons.
Thank you.
And a shout out to vendors. I think I saw a couple names out there. Most of them are very happy to, you know, make changes to their products. It's sometimes they just don't know, and that's why it's a partnership. We help them out.
Well, with that, I want to thank Renee very much for your talk. Maybe you could stop your sharing so we can see everyone. And I just want to say, you know, thanks again for joining us and telling us your story. And thanks to Harry for moderating, and for all of you who came and you know, engaged and participated in the talk. I want to oh, Renee, you shared that just with me. You want to shift it over to the public so that they can see it too. I just want to thank everyone, and this kind of brings almost to the end our day 3 of the summit. We have one more session, which is our Summit After Dark session tonight at 7 p.m. I hope that you will come and join us to have a little social time together, hang out and talk about the sessions, and just see each other and have a little bit of informal opportunity to hang out and talk. John Zelnick has some fun things planned for us, and I hope to see as many of you there as possible. And thanks again for coming. Thanks again to Harry and to Renee for sharing your story. It's very, I don't know what the adjective is, like inspiring kind of, to see the work that you've done and the successes that you've had, and for sharing the challenges and some of your solutions. It's very cool to see. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome. Take care, everybody.